You are listening to the Kelly Confidential podcast with Kelly Wilkes. This is episode 6. Welcome to the Kelly Confidential Show, where we talk negotiation essentials and those crucial conversations empowering extraordinary women. Real women, real issues. Let's jump in. Well, hello, lovely people, and welcome to the show. I hope your week is going well. Definitely a warmer week in the UK this week than this time 2 weeks ago. I started producing this episode then 2 weeks ago. It was International Women's Week, incidentally, and it snowed across much of the UK that week. I remember I took the train to my clients' offices that Wednesday, and it was just so beautiful starting out. It was all white and like a picture postcard. It really made me homesick for some proper thick Colorado snow. But by the time I got to my destination, the fluffy white stuff had turned into typical snowy gray sludge, a texture I think only Brits would understand. We just don't do snow well here. It's too wet and rainy to make it last. Anyway, as I tee up to my bigger topic about women in climate change, I wanted to pause for a minute and reflect on International Women's Day for a moment. And hey, here's a question. Why is it that Valentine's Day and International Women's Day are hailed for a single day only out of 365? Does that mean that we are to be celebrated only once a year? Or that our value is worth 365th? Just like the love you feel on your Valentine's? I don't get it. It's a bit of a rub. I think both should be valued, revered even in some cases, every day, really. And while I do gratefully applaud all of the hard efforts of the women and men who work so hard to organize the IWD events every year, and big shout out to all the fierce female sisters listening, I can't get my head around this year's motto, embrace equity. Have you heard about it? It was called Embrace Equity. So I need to ask, was it me or did embrace equity feel really off, just off? I mean, what does it mean? It just feels out there, like a ship at sea with no port to go to. I've asked this same question of most of my female friends and colleagues. And all of them, no joke, all of them just stared at me when I asked, and they said the same thing. What does it mean? And I said, exactly. I don't understand it. And I don't understand the message, I guess. And is it telling us or is it telling everybody? Because I think women have been saying that for quite a long time now, but we don't want to embrace it. We're demanding it. And I don't understand the accompanying image of a woman hugging herself in a self-soothing way. Like, really? It's like something you would see from Tina Fey on Saturday Night Live, except this is real life. So no, I'm not really sure. And I am genuinely asking what people think about this. And I'm really open to opinions and input. It just seems to suggest that if we all just say these words and hug ourselves in a self-soothing way, it will sort the deep pay and power disparity that still exists across the world. And worrying, too, is the absence of reflection on the growing, I think, change to women's rights, the contraction of liberties and representation in a variety of places, hidden in plain sight, really, mainstream. What do I mean? Well, here's a couple of big examples. The first, the repeal of the Roe versus Wade federal reproductive rights protections in the United States. That's a pretty big whopper. And secondly, the notable decline in high-profile female world leaders in a really short space of time, 3, in fact, in the last 16 months. Angela Merkel of Germany, Jacinda Ardern of New Zealand, and Nicola Sturgeon of Scotland. And so who have we got representing the female voice in the G7? Well, just one, Giorgia Meloni from Italy. That's quite lonely. Very lonely club to be part of. And who does that leave in the G20? Well, only 3. Georgia again, Narendra Modi from India, and Ursula von der Leyen representing the EU. And yet, despite the fact that women, we, are making big leaps in leadership posts in various sectors, including major jumps in startups and in finance, to take more risks than we have ever before, women rarely reach executive board positions in any industry. That means we are rarely holding the top job amongst huge businesses and medium-sized businesses that are making major decisions about whole economies. According to Forbes and the UN Gender Index, that happens less than 10% of the time, in fact, and only in rich, progressive countries. So where's the motto that helps us with that? Personally, close the gap does it for me. Yep. Simple, to the point, close the gap. It covers all bases: pay disparity, political representation, executive posts, fair access to investment capital, and so on. Because why? Well, because over the past decade or so, while many developed countries have celebrated the 100th anniversary of emancipation, that's over 100 years for quite a few countries, I think 110 for quite a few, women still remain in the bottom 30th percentile globally for positions of power and influence. These are big disparities, and I've got a handful of statistics here just to show that point. So here we go. Land ownership, 12.6%. Small business ownership, 20% and under. Corporate executive posts, 5 to 9%. Access to capital and investor funding, 6 to 16%. Holding municipal, state, and federal office, 28% and under. And that 28% that I share is for wealthier countries, the wealthiest countries, in fact. And studies and my own experience, my experiences have shown that the more successful the woman in business ownership or in executive leadership posts, for example, the more these numbers shrink. And so to my main topic, what does all of this have to do with climate change? And it's a good time to talk about this, isn't it? Because we saw the report that came out from the IPCC a couple of days ago, and it is not good. So we need to be talking about it. And for some time now, the UN has been charting the effects of climate change on women and found that women were disproportionately disadvantaged far more than men. So much so that specific provisions for women have been made in the 2015 Paris Agreement, SDG 5 specifically. That's Sustainable Development Goal number 5, gender equality, part of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals, which I discuss in my podcast with Dr. Samantha O'Loughlin. Anyway, the BBC reported in 2018 that UN figures indicated that 80% of people displaced by climate change are women. 80%. So why is this? Why is that happening? That's just a huge, huge number. Many reasons. Partly because around the world, especially in developing and poor nations, women are left behind to tend to land and livestock and children, while the men go to town to work or to sell goods or services. Enter weather-based climate change, extreme climate change, where increasingly sustained dry periods lead to drought or fires, where prolonged rains lead to extreme flooding, deadly mudslides, and all of these result in land unfit to grow crops or feed livestock and ultimately create food shortages, famine, and disease, leaving women and families more vulnerable than ever before. And this issue of imbalance isn't limited to just rural and underdeveloped areas. This is a global issue. Statistically, women have less socioeconomic power than men, and the notable underrepresentation of female political leaders to influence the laws and balance access to jobs and resources means that women are far more likely to experience poverty and will suffer more and for longer when trying to rebuild following an extreme weather or climate disaster. Rutgers University professor Jacqueline Litt noted in her study at the time following Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, that more than half the poor families in the city were headed by single mothers. More than half. Before Katrina, they were reliant on interdependent community networks for their everyday survival and resources. The displacement that happened after Katrina essentially eroded those networks, made them just unavailable, placing women and their children at much, much greater risk for a long time afterwards. Climate change is a global crisis that affects us all, but its impacts are just definitely not equal. Women, more than men, are left far more vulnerable by the consequences of a changing climate, and their voices are often left out of the decision-making process that could mitigate it. Women are disproportionately affected in 3 key ways. Let me share them with you here. Number 1, food insecurity. According to the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, women make up the majority of small-scale farmers in developing countries and are responsible for a significant portion of food production. Climate change impacts like unpredictable weather patterns, droughts, and floods make it harder for these women to grow crops and feed their families, leading to increased food insecurity. Number 2, health risks. Climate change can lead to the spread of infectious diseases like malaria and dengue fever, which disproportionately affects women and children. In addition, natural disasters and displacement due to extreme weather events can lead to a loss of access to healthcare and safe water, again, putting women's health at risk. Number 3, economic insecurity. Women are more likely to work in low-paying informal sectors and are often the first to lose their jobs during economic downturns. Climate change impacts like crop failures and declining fisheries can lead to economic hardship, making it even harder for women to make ends meet. These are just a few of the ways that women are affected. This quote by a delegate in the United Nations Development Program asserts that women are often on the front lines of the impacts of climate change, yet their leadership and contributions to solutions are frequently undervalued, and their voices are underrepresented in decision-making. If you like my show and want to hear more of these topics, please give me a like and follow us. And please join my mail list to find out about upcoming courses which will be heading your way this spring. Go to kellyconfidential.com and subscribe to our newsletter. There is a critical need for a gender-responsive approach to tackling the climate crisis. SDG 5 reminds us that we must ensure that the voices and experiences of women are at the center of efforts to address the impacts of climate change. They're impacted more 80% of the time. So women must have a voice at the center of mitigating climate change. So where is our power in that? It's in our ability to earn and in our purchasing power. I'll tackle the earnings part of this in a follow-up episode, but for now, let's talk about women's purchasing power. This is where things start to get a bit complicated, so stay with me. Considered the most powerful consumers, women dominate consumer purchasing power, particularly household purchases. This is really something to pay attention to. If you are in marketing, finance, commerce, you run a business, you're in a startup, really pay attention to these and do your research here because this is significant. According to MSN's January 2023 article, there's a link in my show notes, women contribute to 37% of the global GDP. 37%. That is not a big number. It might sound big because it's double digit, but it's still well under 50%. Women need to earn more. We are only earning 37% of the global domestic product. But over 80% of purchases and purchase influence are held by women, including the decision-making for 91% of home purchases in the United States. The most successful business leaders and indeed politicians have realized in the past decade that if you want to sell an idea or product, you need to market it to women. And this, my friends, is where the relationship goes off the rails. Fast fashion. I'm talking about fast fashion, women's purchasing power and fast fashion. Stay with me. So what is fast fashion? It is a high production, cheaply made garment typically mass produced in low-income countries with ambiguous human rights oversight. Many such garment production industries have, at some point in the past 20 years, in many cases been investigated for sweatshop manufacturing practices. You need only type sweatshop and high street fashion into Google and several lawsuit articles will pop up, often with high street brand names that you'll recognize. What does all of this mean? Well, let's look at some sobering statistics. Again, I've got some statistics. I'm a researcher about the fast fashion trade. Again, I've got reference links in the show notes. Number one, women contribute to more than 80% of fast fashion globally. What is it? So basically, we are the buyers. Women far outreach men in the consumerism of fast fashion. Number two, with the advent of fast fashion consumerism in a short 15 years, clothing sales doubled from 100 billion units a year to a skyrocketing 200 billion units a year. This despite the fact that the average number of times an item was worn dropped by 36% overall. I mean, just think about that. 200 billion units a year of clothing. There are only like 6.5 billion people on the planet. That's crazy. That's a crazy number. Number three, according to the UNEP, 20% of global wastewater is produced by the textiles and fashion industry. How? By consuming around 93 billion cubic meters of water for textile dyeing, leaving the rest contaminated by toxic chemicals. And because the majority of countries producing fast fashion are underregulated, that contaminated wastewater ends up in our rivers and our seas. Number four, we as purchasers, remember this is 80% women, throw out roughly 92 million tons of clothes-related waste each year. This is both clothes and plastics used to package them. This equates to a garbage truck of clothes either incinerated or left to the landfill every second of the day, or enough to fill the Empire State Building full every single day on repeat. I have to admit, these stats in particular really upset me, that they are now virtually everywhere in our environment. Apparently found not just everywhere in the seas and in the digestive tracts of our fish and sea life, but airborne and carried through the rains and snows to end up on the peaks of Mount Everest. True, you can Google it. They did test samples on the peaks of Mount Everest and found microplastics. Number six, the fashion industry contributes to roughly 10% of all global carbon emissions and is the number 2 worst offender for water and plastics pollution. Oh, that's a lot. That is a lot. So I'll stop with those statistics. If that wasn't enough to convince you of the huge climate impact posed by fast fashion, I don't know. You may never be convinced, and maybe these podcasts aren't for you. But it's important that we talk about it because for the rest of us, it's grim. It's grim, and a huge wake up call, and a huge pill to swallow. Because as women, we care so much. And yet we're so underrepresented in a number of categories of power and influence, at the mercy of poverty, food scarcity, and homelessness in the face of climate disasters. And yet, women's huge appetite for fast fashion is directly aiding that crisis. Let me say that again. Women are directly contributing to their own crisis. And worse, women of wealthy countries, in particular, the US, the UK, European countries, are directly contributing to the dire conditions imposed on our sisters in poor and underdeveloped countries, making it exponentially harder for them to grow and reach positions of socioeconomic freedom. We have a responsibility. So what can we do? Well, we can do a lot. And all of it helps if we all do something, like something. So I did some research, as you would expect, and I've got another list. And so here are some of the most impactful recommendations, things that we can all attempt. Number 1, educate yourself and recognize your purchasing influence. Research designers, check labels, read about the materials and from which country the trousers, the skirt, dress, and so forth are made. Both the material compound and the manufacturing location are printed clearly on all labels. Number 2, try to buy from ethical and eco-friendly manufacturers. I've provided a short sample list in the show notes. I saw Patagonia in there, which is recognizable, but there are many eco-friendly boutiques, even in Windsor here in my little town. Even if you do it every third purchase, just make the effort. It will help. Number 3, do not throw out your clothes or any textiles in the trash. It just ends up in the massive landfill. Remember my point earlier about the Empire State Building? Please don't do this. Recycle your old clothes and shoes by donating to charities and organizations that can recycle or upcycle for new clothes, or they repurpose them. Some can be made into handbags, rugs, carpet materials. Most towns have recycling centers near the tip. They'll have big bins that are specifically for textiles and clothing. You can also Google this. And I know, like in my little village here in Windsor, our local leisure center, our local gym, they have big, heavy-duty industrial-sized bins out front marked specifically for clothes and textiles. So yeah, number 4, buy cotton or hemp-based materials. These are kinder on the planet, and try to reduce or cut out polyester and nylon-based fabrics because they create microplastics. Very, very, bad for the seas and the environment. Number 5, change the way you wash your clothes. This was something I didn't actually realize how significant it was, and how quickly you could improve it. So this is a real easy thing to do. Washing half loads at a lower temperature. And if you substitute every 6th dryer usage with total air drying, that can cut your consumer carbon footprint by half. So that's a good one. Number 6, embrace the classics. Really, any wardrobe, this is my personal opinion, you may not agree with this, but stay with me. Any wardrobe, I think, benefits from a few good staple pieces like good quality jeans, cotton tees, blazers. And if you pair this with some classics from great designers, I think Chanel, DVF, Ralph Lauren, Gucci, Tom Ford. Hang on, I can hear you all going, what? But, because those are all really expensive, aren't they? Like, I don't have any originals. Well, I think I've got a Ralph Lauren I got on sale at Macy's. But what I'm saying is you make these purchases secondhand. Yep, I said it and I wear it. eBay is not the old eBay. And places like Vinted and Net-a-Porter provide wonderful avenues to buying terrific, pre-loved fashion classics that never go out of style. It's better for the wallet and better for the climate. And finally, number 7, measure your own carbon footprint. How? There are a few great sites where you can complete a short survey to measure your lifestyle and related carbon footprint. I've put a link in the show notes. These are self-serve, free, and easy to use. In summary, it's it's not as simple. This is complex, right? It's not as simple as saying fast fashion is devastating to landfill and water systems and animals. Its meteoric consumer demand has had a direct and consequential bearing on the lives of women and families around the world. In many respects, fast fashion has been helpful because it's cheap, right? It gives women access to clothes and fashion trends that they may not have had access to otherwise. But the downside is so much bigger than the benefit. Destruction left by floods, fires, famine, and drought are likely linked to the high carbon footprint created by this polluting trend. A buying trend tragically fortified by the women sweatshop workers who are part of the communities that suffer the consequences of climate change the most. And the more women and families go without access to basic needs like housing, food security, and healthcare brought on by these climate disasters, the less socioeconomic influence and representation they have. It's just circular. It just keeps exacerbating the problem. And why is that such an issue? Well, beyond the humanitarian crisis that this all creates, studies by the UN, the International Monetary Fund, the OECD, and numerous universities have shown that when women are fully represented at work, at home, in politics, and in their local communities, when they are there and they have a seat at the table in all aspects, it leads to significant GDP growth. Not just the marginal 37% that I talked about. It's big. It reduces poverty, it improves education, and creates better health for the whole family. Please let's all consider our incredibly important purchasing power. It's, 80%. That is not a small number. The consequences of blind consumerism and throwaway culture are difficult to defend to the next generation of women. We can do better. Did this episode really float your boat? Well, check out my show notes. I've included a list of top female leaders who have made significant contributions to addressing climate change. Some names may surprise you, together with a list of some useful sites to the leading climate oversight bodies and LinkedIn pages that you can follow. And hey, follow me too on LinkedIn for good measure, as I'm regularly reposting content about people and planet. And really, good luck in your personal efforts. Just know each action we take makes a difference. The key for all of us is to start. Take care until next time.